biographer of Texas, Stephen Murdoch, who said, "The Texas of today is the US of tomorrow." So looking at how this convergence of national trends is crystallized in the state of Texas, I formulated this 3-point argument that I wanted to explore. First point, increasing the number of young children from historically disadvantaged segments of society in high-quality early childhood education is a potentially effective strategy for combating persistent inequalities in attainment, including those related to the large, growing, and often threatened Latino population. Point 2, this goal can be supported by a holistic approach, recognizing the different ways that early childhood education classrooms are connected to the larger context in which they're situated and encompass a complex exchange of academic and social processes. And point 3, such an approach requires careful attention to the daily experiences of children, their teachers, and their parents in and around early childhood education classrooms. And the Texas Public Pre-K program is an ideal place to do just that for Latino children. Now, this 3-point argument also led to a more concrete set of questions. What about early childhood education for Latino children is working, and what needs to be improved? Now, to explore this argument and answer these questions, I and some of my students spent over a year in a large, diverse, metropolitan urban school district that I call Southwest. And we refer to this as a bellwether district, right? Like it's saying something about where other districts are soon going to be experienced. It's like on the leading edge of those things. It's a huge district. It's majority Latino, with a very strong representation of children from immigrant families, from Latin American immigrant families, especially Mexico. It's got, it's got a long-standing pre-K program serving over 6,000 students, and it's school-based. So the pre-K classrooms are in the elementary schools, which, basically instead of being K through 5th grade, they're now pre-K through 5th grade. With this one little quirk, which is that a set of schools didn't have the physical capacity to have this pre-K on site. So to deal with this, the district at the time opened up a separate pre-K campus that housed these pre-K programs. So the children were still students at the elementary schools. They just happened to attend pre-K offsite at this pre-K campus, which doesn't exist anymore, but it did at the time. Now, given the eligibility requirements of the state program and the district, the overwhelming majority of children in this pre-K program are Latino and come from low-income families, and a large number of them come from families where Spanish is the first language at home, or the predominant language at home. So within Southwest, we sampled 9 schools and 58 classrooms within those schools, which represented every pre-K classroom across those 9 schools, plus one randomly selected classroom from kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade within each of these schools. Now, these schools have different official designations in terms of language instruction, dual language, ESL, those types of things. But the broadest category in most of these is what we classified as predominantly Spanish language, which means that the large majority of teaching and learning in the classroom is happening in Spanish. So in these classrooms, we did 2 things. The first is what I call watching, which means that we used a systematic observational protocol for assessing classroom quality called the CLASS, which is used in all sorts of national and state evaluations, including Head Start. And we did this in every classroom. And the CLASS is, a way of, it's an observe and record cycle where raters who've been centrally trained are cued to look for specific things. They observe for a period, then they take notes, and then they come up with ratings across different subdimensions of classroom quality. And those subdimensions can then be combined into 3 large dimensions. One is emotional support, which is really about the social and emotional climate of the school, or of the classroom, The other is classroom management or classroom organization, which is about how teachers are managing classroom activities and managing children. And then the third is instructional support, which is really getting at how cognitively stimulating the activities in the classroom are. Now, the second activity was what we call talking, which meant that we did semi-structured interviews with all the teachers and teachers' aides from those 58 classrooms. And the majority of those teachers were Latino themselves, and the majority of them were also bilingual. And we also did focus groups with parents selected from across the different classrooms. They were all mothers, just like the teachers were all women. And most of them weren't just Latina, they were actually immigrants, who had been born and gone through their schooling in their home country, which was usually Mexico. And so all of this watching and talking was organized by my reformulation of a theory about how children make the transition into elementary school. And contextual systems theory basically says that, children, that the transition from early childhood education into elementary school is really is grounded in the exchanges among the different contexts of a child's life, their families, schools, communities, etc. And argues that children from more vulnerable segments of the population, like the ones that are being studied here, have smoother transitions when all of those contexts are in conversation with each other. And in conversation can be literal, meaning that they're all talking to each other, or it can be more figurative, meaning that they're all like coming from the same playbook, like they're all on the same page when it comes to educating this child. And so my formulation of this theory really has the early childhood education classroom as the unit of analysis, as the focal point, and then tries to situate those classrooms within the exchanges among contexts that are larger than the classroom, and then can be broken down into the exchanges among its own constituent parts. So we ask, well, is the early childhood education classroom in conversation with larger context? That's what we call contextual connections. And are the independent or internal parts of the early childhood education classroom in conversation with each other? And that's what we call contextual processes. So a little bit more, what we did was two versions of contextual connections. The in school is about alignment among classrooms, and out of school is about family school community partnerships. And there's also two forms of contextual processes we were interested in. Cross philosophy is about the interplay between different approaches to organizing an early childhood education classroom. And cross activity is really just about the balance of different kinds of activities within the classroom. Now, we focused on each of these. In the book, there's a chapter on each of them, and I'm just going to highlight two here: the in-school contextual connections and the cross philosophy contextual processes. So for the in-school contextual connections, we focused on alignment. And alignment is the idea, is really about the systematic coordination of curriculum, teacher prep, and classroom activities across classrooms, right? Which is thought to be a special protective factor for children who are more vulnerable to being like lost in the system or slipping through the cracks, which the children in this sample definitely were. And alignment can be horizontal, meaning, across classrooms in a grade, or vertical, meaning across classrooms in contiguous grades. And we use the teacher interviews to identify each classroom as low, medium, high on both vertical and horizontal alignment. And what we found is that only a small number of classrooms had no evidence of either kind of alignment. And the majority of classrooms had elements of both forms of alignment. But when there was only one form of alignment, it was always horizontal. So there was never a case where a classroom is vertically aligned, but not horizontally aligned. But that differs across different kinds of classrooms. So for example, Cole is the pre-K campus that I told you about. That arrangement seems to be very conducive to horizontal alignment, but not so much to vertical alignment. And when you look at the predominantly Spanish classrooms, you see they have higher odds of falling into that no alignment category, meaning that they're more isolated within schools and within the district than other kinds of classrooms. And, perhaps not surprisingly, when you talk to teachers about this, they view their same grade peers as their like natural home base, right? And so horizontal alignment really emerges more organically in those situations, especially in the pre-K campus, which that's all there is. Like it's just a big room and they're all doing the same thing. Vertical alignment needs a nudge, right? Like it's more likely to need a nudge from above. Like that might be principal, school policy, professional development programs, things like that. It needs that nudge to make it happen more often. But it's also facilitated by something that we call self-alignment, which is when teachers themselves have been in multiple grades and they have more experience about like, you know, what to expect above and below their grades. And so, you know, this self-alignment, teachers who have that, it's not just that they understand this thing, it's that they're more open to and more proactive about building vertical alignment networks. Now, the barrier, and so, for example, one of the teachers told us, because I've taught the other grades, I know what's coming up for them, so I can push them a little further along, which one of the reasons why I went to the other grades, right? Like, you know, she viewed this as a value, and it does seem to have value for vertical alignment. Now, the barriers to alignment are sometimes, you know, you might think of as obvious, which is that, you know, it's just another thing that teachers need to do in a day that's already too short. It's also true that as school size increases, the number of pieces that have to be coordinated increases, and that's an impediment. But it's also true that both pre-K teachers and K first and second grade teachers very consistently view the pre-K classrooms as segregated, right? That might be physically segregated, that, you know, in the case of the kids who are the classrooms that are in the pre-K campus, or, you know, just the way that the building's arranged. But it's more than that. It's also more social and psychological, this separation, you know, and even there's this sentiment underlying that's expressed sometimes that the pre-K classrooms aren't really the same thing as the rest of the school. Like that's a different thing. It's not real. And so one of the teachers said, in pre-K, we walk alone. And sometimes we like the stepchild that's not. We're not even at the table, but if they throw us the food, we're pretty happy. So this is like, I think, like a psychic separation that really needs to be addressed. Now, when we moved to the connected processes, you know, we were really interested in the supposed tension between different philosophies about early childhood education. On one hand, you know, this idea that the purpose of it is to support positive development in general, so that children are then, you know, equipped to make the transition into elementary school. On the other hand, some people put more of a focus on saying, well, no, it's about building specific cognitive and academic skills that can then be deployed in the curricula of K through 12 schooling. And these are often pitted against each other, you know, the latter sometimes thinking that the former is soft, or the former thinking that the latter is just completely untethered with developmental reality. But we could think of this not as an or, but as an and in how they support each other. And to do that, we tried to identify classrooms that were developmentally supportive and academically scaffolding, meaning that they're classrooms that provide a safe and secure space for children to come together and forge interpersonal connections with their teachers and with their peers, so that they can develop a sense of themselves and sense of the world. And then, you know, that allows them to then face academic challenges. And that, you know, is good for children. That kind of classroom is good for children in general, but it's especially good for children who have more obstacles in their path in the educational system, like the children from low-income Latino families that we were studying. So we used the different parameters of the class, the three main dimensions of the class, and how they clustered together within classrooms. And this is only for the pre-K classrooms. And what we found is that the majority of classrooms were in the middle, that they were supportive but not scaffolding, meaning that they were above the national average in emotional support and classroom organization, but below the national average in instructional support. Now, the remaining classrooms were split evenly between the ones that were kind of like all good things go together, they were above the national average on everything, or they don't go together, you know, like the absence goes together, where they were below the national average on all three dimensions. And we called those less engaging. Now, the supportive and scaffolding, you know, The predominantly Spanish classrooms had a really interesting pattern, which is that they had higher odds of being in supportive and scaffolding category or the less engaging. So it's kind of like they were on the extremes, not the middle, which is what the norm was for everybody else. And, when we talk to teachers, they very consistently and unprompted said the ones that were identified as having supportive and scaffolding classrooms really articulated that they had these academic benchmarks that they had to meet, like that was part of their job, that they viewed supporting the social and emotional development of children as like a major ingredient for doing that. If not in the short term, in the long term, like they had a broader view of this stuff. And they really viewed that part of their job as being incredibly rewarding. So, one teacher says success is when they show me understanding what I'm teaching when they solve problems. When I assess them and they're able to explain to me things with more than just one word, when they elaborate, that's what makes me feel really good about myself and about teaching the students, and that's what makes me smile. Her strategy for getting kids to this point was really about fostering fostering them as children more than fostering them as students, and then the latter flowed from the former. They also had uniformly high expectations for their students on day one, and it wasn't like a child who comes into their classroom with less developed skills, academic skills, would be written off. Like that just really didn't happen as much with them, and they didn't carry that bias forward. So one teacher says, what I like is when I can say, wow, he's come so far. Sometimes I forget that, and somebody has to remind me at the beginning of the year, right? He can tell you maybe not every letter, by the end, he can tell you maybe not every letter, but I mean, that is what success is, right? So they're recalibrating this on this more, it's really more about the growth of the child as opposed to these absolute standards. Now, the other teachers tended to focus more on social and emotional development. And that might be because, there's a lot to do in a classroom and there's just something distracting them from the academically scaffolding side of things, or maybe it's getting interrupted. Or there was a subset of teachers that were really focused on children's discipline, like in managing the behavior of children, to the point that other things in the classroom kind of fell away. Right. And so one teacher is like, when you talk to them about classrooms, they flip it around and say, a not good classroom is when they don't have that discipline or when I don't have that structure. I would say classroom management is the most important thing, where they're not paying attention, everyone's doing their own thing. So this is certainly a important quality of a classroom, but it becomes like the sole thing that those teachers were thinking about. So basically there's this like false divide for different approaches to arranging a classroom or what the classroom is supposed to be doing. And that's probably not helping anybody. And it's something that we can address moving forward. Now, for the other contextual connections, I looked at family school partnerships, and that's really like everybody talks the same talk. They use the right words. They talk about partnerships and being on the same team. But when you actually look at what's happening, it's much more unidirectional. It's more school directed, and that might be understandable. There's many reasons why that would be, and many of them are understandable, but it's not really in conversation, right? Like it doesn't really capture that spirit. And then for the connected processes, it was really what we found was that in the predominantly Spanish speaking classrooms, there's such an emphasis on language instruction, like it sucks up the time and the energy of everybody involved, so that there's other activities that might be happening in other classrooms that those children are not getting. This happens throughout the K through 12 educational career, right? Like this is a long-standing story about the balance between language instruction and other kinds of instructional activities. But it's really acute here at early childhood education, which of course is the first point, and it's setting up the rest of the career. Now, across, what I tried to do at the end of the book was summarize the main points for these four things: the contextual connections and the connected processes. And I did it in three domains: what I observed, or what we observed, what we learned, like the lessons that were learned from what we observed, and then third, how those lessons learned could then be applied. And I want to share with you the main points for each of those 3 domains. First, for the observed, what we observed. Horizontal alignment across classrooms was more common and easier than vertical alignment among classrooms. The talk about family school partners, community partnerships did not always match reality. Different kinds of positive learning and teaching processes tend to go together within classrooms, leading to stark differences across classrooms. And cognitively stimulating instruction is difficult in the face of other instructional challenges. So what were the lessons learned? Communication is a key element of contextual connections that has to be purposefully cultivated. Activities that underlie the development of cognitive and academic skills are the most vulnerable elements of connected processes. Common ground is essential to contextual connections and connected processes and requires attention to potential fissures. And organizational structures can promote or undermine contextual connections and connected processes in concrete ways. So what about the applications? Well, we can use mediators to deepen school-based discussions and conversations. We can emphasize the value of interactional supports for critical thinking and professional development. We can put extra weight into diversifying teaching staffs, and we can encourage fluidity among grade levels and positions. So if you want to know more about what we observed and what we learned and how we applied those lessons learned, you can look at the starting line, or you can send me an email, or you can listen to Dina Castro, who's about to talk and knows more about this subject, or probably has forgotten more about this subject than I will ever know, and you can trust me on that one. It was good to be here, and I look forward to talking some more. And I'm trying to get out of here. Okay.
Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Dina, welcome. And I'm glad that you guys will be able to have a conversation. And if folks want to continue to put questions into the Q&A, we'll help to moderate that with you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I'm very happy to be here with you. And congratulations, Robert, on the publication of this book, One More Book, and your contributions to the field of early childhood and the field of child development. You know, we all know about them and really appreciate how your work is informing our work as well. In this case in particular, I was very excited when I saw the publication that you have published this book about Latino children in Texas. And, you know, I've been here in Texas, you know, living and working in Texas for the last 7 years and trying to get involved, of course, in the field of early childhood, both as a researcher, as a teacher, educator, and more recently also working with colleagues in the policy arena. So this work definitely is informing all the efforts that we are trying to promote here in Texas to support young children in general, and in particular, the population of Latino and English learners in Texas. So we appreciate that very much. I would like to extend the conversation with you about a couple of points in particular that I think are very important and may call my attention. You just you mentioned in something that I am very convinced that when in the early childhood education field, we for dual language learners in particular, we seem to emphasize language instruction too much, to the point that sometimes we may be losing sight of other important aspects of children's development that are happening as well in the classroom, and of course within their families and communities. So I would like to hear from you a little bit more about that, what your recommendations will be, you know, when we're regarding this, what is happening. You mentioned something about the balance between content, you know, and language instruction.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I mean, I have before, I should preface this by saying that, you know, I actually started my career and spent the first decade or so of being a researcher studying high schools. And this was actually something that would come up a lot in there. And it was, often referred to as a double disadvantage, which is that, you had students who would come in and they, English wasn't their first language. They needed to develop some of those English language skills to be able to fully engage in the curriculum. But in the process, getting them to that point, they weren't doing other things that students in their grade were doing, right? And so there was this gap. And I would have, I knew about that. I would observe it. I didn't realize, and I obviously expected to see that in early childhood education too. Like there's no reason you would, but it was so much more pronounced there, and I was just thinking at the time, where I would go into a classroom where children would be involved in all of these really stimulating activities that, I don't want to call them content-based, but they were more substantively focused. And that wasn't happening in some of these other classrooms. There was a subset of those classrooms where it was happening, and basically the teachers were just really adept at adapting those other kinds of activities as the vehicle for language instruction, right? And so this always becomes a thing, you know this better than I, that you never know if it's a magical teacher or if it's the actual approach between those two things. But that seemed to be the ability to connect those two things seemed to be what was important. But I was also very sympathetic to the teachers who would talk to me and just be like, my school is like, they view my job as getting these kids so that when they go to kindergarten, when quote unquote real school starts, that they have the language skills to be able to engage in that. And that's really how I'm being evaluated and what I'm thinking of. And I have to say, they're not wrong on that too, and I understand that dilemma that they're in.
Thank you. I think this topic is very, is very important because, we think that, and also the evidence from research tells us the importance of bilingualism. But I think the conflict probably comes from the perspective that, the concern that children need to learn English.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus is on, to the point that children may end up becoming monolingual English speakers, using their first language as early as in pre-K or kindergarten. So those are the debates that we are involved in. And I would share that I think fortunately here in Texas, we'll share the information that we are part of a consortium an initiative for Texas early childhood education for Texas English learners. And one of the aspects that we're emphasizing and actually going to request to the legislature here in Texas is to extend funding to support dual language education access for young Texans, the young children, young dual language learners. And we know that in Texas, the majority of them are of Latino descent. So let's see how it goes. But currently, what we have, where we see the tensions is with the language of instruction issue, is about 80% of children who are English learners in Texas in early childhood are attending either ESL modalities or bilingual transitional modalities, and therefore, in which both of them are targeting English acquisition only and without really providing support for home language development and learning. So, and versus 20%, that only 20% have access to dual language immersion programs, which are the ones supporting bilingual development. So we could talk more about that, but definitely the bottom line for me is bilingualism in these children who are born in homes that gives them the opportunity to become bilingual. It should be supported throughout their education. And not only because it's important, but in terms of their cognitive development and their prospects for life, economically, financially, in the future, but because that's a characteristic that is part of who they are. And I think we lose sight of that. You mentioned something about the importance of social emotional support. And I think that's, taking, sometimes without, of course, being the intention, we may end up taking away a part of who these children are that may help them. I'm talking about their home language, that help them make connections, right? Make connections with their world around them. So, that's I think an important message.
Can I just add something, Dina, to what you were saying about dual language, which is that in that category of predominantly Spanish classrooms, a minority of those classrooms actually are dual language classrooms, and they have kids who come from predominantly English-speaking backgrounds, predominantly Spanish, and they're mixed together. And it's just a pedagogical approach to early childhood education, as you were mentioned. Though when you look across these different things I was looking at, they actually fit better, are more likely to be categorized with the with the English only classrooms, and just in terms of the way they look, and not with the more ESL type classrooms. So the distinction there really is the dual language classrooms. They're kind of floating in the middle, but they're more similar to the English only classrooms than to those predominantly Spanish classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there is, well, I'm talking about the models and how they are defined and their goals, right? And definitely also we find a lot of diversity in how this is different, and you have been in those classrooms, there are differences from one classroom to the next, even though they might be classified as being, under certain model of instruction or language of instruction. So that's a lot of diversity. And that brings us to the point that you also were mentioning about, is about the teacher, is about the curriculum, is about the in this case, the language of instruction model. And we know that the teacher really is, at the end of the day, is who is going to make a difference in what happens in the classroom and what is the impact on children. So great. So let's see. I think we have some questions also from the audience for you. Let's see. Okay, let me start with this one. It says, I would love to talk to you about how you've created universal pre-K with only 40% in public schools. We are currently trying to create a similar universal access mixed delivery model in Utah.
Well, Dina, maybe you have some thoughts or reactions to that too. I mean, I wasn't really involved in the creation of these things, so of this program, and so I don't really know as much about what the iterative success and failure thing. Okay, so Cynthia said that was directed to someone else. Okay, that makes sense.
I think it is more about, we are in that path in Texas. I don't think we have a definite answer for this, unfortunately, either. Okay, let's go to this other question. There is a push to develop or encourage partnerships between pre-K in the independent school districts, schools or public schools, and private high-quality childcare centers, at least in Dallas, Texas, because of the need for more pre-K classrooms in the schools, and also the negative economic impact on childcare centers as they lose attendance in their 4-year-old classrooms due to free pre-K challenges here. What are the challenges here?
Yeah, I mean, this is an age-old tension in the creation of public pre-K. I mean, there's a really interesting book called Standardized Childhood that's about the California system and about these tensions. And I think that the tension is that, the more school-based ones, that the ones that are sponsored by the districts, it's just easier to spread the oversight of the district to those. And that makes coordination, that makes alignment, that makes all of these things easier, not easy, but easier. But the downside, of course, is that it's often the private programs, the community-based programs that know the community, right? That know the kids better and maybe have a different philosophy than the one that is predominant in the formal educational system and within districts. And so, we could say, well, we need to figure out some way of bridging those divides. But of course, I don't know. There's not an easy way to do that, right? Like to get, we're trying to get the best of both worlds where we can have some of that like built-in coordination, but also maintain the community knowledge and the community resources.
Thank you. And there's another question here for you is, did you look at or find disconnect between Spanish language use focused in the pre-K classroom and testing and or language of instruction in the later grades? We've previously found that in some areas of Texas, Spanish-speaking children are not being tested in their native language for kindergarten readiness assessment. Yeah, definitely. I see it's a big challenge there. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's mostly what we saw. I mean, I wasn't following the children over time. I was just looking at the different grades and trying to make an assumption about what would happen to a kid moving through this system, and what arrangement would the kid kind of have the smoothest trajectory, like with the least unstable trajectory. And, it does, I mean, I definitely heard from teachers. I was more likely to hear from the parent support specialists and the parents themselves, this concern that was just raised about at what point do children start getting, are they ready to be assessed in English versus, the home language? And if that happens too late, if that transition happens too late, or too early, how that affects, the way that schools invest in. I'm not talking about teachers in general, but, we all know that expectations of what children do can be set very early. And that question about assessment and language of assessment can bias those expectations, right? You might say, well, this kid isn't ready for this, or this kid, is starting from this foundation, when it's really more just about language than the actual capacity of the child. So that was what people were really concerned about. And they're right, I mean, and this is a perfect example of how biases can happen to well-meaning and well-intentioned people too. This is just the way that works.
Yeah. Well, and I think you have mentioned something, these things happen to well-meaning people. We probably could make the connection here to the concept of implicit bias. We may have the best of intentions, or think that we have the best of intentions, but our biases actually are acting and are active in our brains and really influencing our behavior. And those are formed from the society in which we're living and growing up. And so our biases exist, and we have to be aware of them. Otherwise, if we want to prevent them from being really hurting the children, and for teachers, this is really crucial.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I know there's a concept called counterfeit social capital, which is really mostly applied to high school students, but it's about this population and the idea that, sometimes the way biases work, that teachers or, school administrators or, or parents, they often, the biases lead them to think that they're doing right by students by saying, well, this student might not be up to the academic challenges. So I'm actually going to kind of lower that a little bit and make sure that they feel happy and secure, and that, has a positive spin to it, because it does come from a place of, support, but it's biased, right? And so, you're giving them something, but taking away. And that's why, implicit biases are so, much more pernicious in many ways than explicit ones.
Yes, definitely, exactly. And those come also from a point of deficit view of the
Yeah.
population, right? So actually, I wanted to ask you now. I was thinking about that while you were talking about the importance of contextual connections, and then and the alignment. So those two pieces, I think, are very important in your work. And I was thinking about how do you think that alignment could help or not? You know,
Mhm.
to address cultural and linguistic diversity within these early childhood classrooms.
Well, this is where I think that the pre-K teachers have such an important role for setting expectations and guarding against biases, especially, when it comes to like the language issues, right? They know these kids better and they see the trajectory of the kids over time. And so when I said earlier about like growth of a child as opposed to like some absolute standard, that's really what vertical alignment allows that information to get passed on, right? And so so that over time, if you have a vertically aligned sequence of classes that kids are moving through, teachers at each stage have an understanding of what's coming to them and what's special about those students, as opposed to the deficit side of things, what assets they're bringing on. And so that's why, like, you see a lot more vertical alignment between K, first and second grade. Pre-K is like the isolate, it's the one out there. But in my opinion, that's the one that has to be the centerpiece of that alignment, because it's the foundation for them. And I'll also tell you that when this book went through review, and alignment is the first main chapter in the book, and all of the reviewers are like, ugh, alignment's so boring. Don't even talk about, like they wanted me to move that to the end of the book. And I'm usually pretty accommodating to things like that, but I refused to do it because it seemed like everything else, it just seems so crucial to that. And, it's like, I don't know, I mean, I will say, and, I'm a university professor, we have no alignment, among our professors too. Like, it applies to every single educational thing. And everyone kind of thinks that they do it more than they do, right? But I think that early childhood, the pre-K teacher piece, it's just the linchpin to everything. I'm just convinced about that.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see, our colleague from Utah, I think, is sharing something else with us. It says, I'm working on early childhood and preschool expansion in Utah, where we also have a very large Latinx and Spanish-speaking population in a very conservative state. We find the bias against Spanish exists both at the system level with conservative policymakers and district leadership, and at the home level, where parents don't want to speak Spanish with their children because they think they need to focus on learning English. And given the importance of first language development, how do you combat these perceptions at the state, district, school, and family level?
So that is a thing, that, like, I think, Dina, I'm sure you've observed this too. I mean, and I will say that over the, decade and a half that I've been doing this, I have seen a decline in that, where, parents are, I'm less likely, in any given instance to see evidence of that. So maybe the trend is in the right direction, but you're right. And I think that a part of it is in the family or community. They're reading something from the school, like the school is, or as the person who asked the question, from above the school, like they're reading the tea leaves, right? And they're reading it well. They're not wrong about what is being valued at the school, and because they want to do right by their kids and they want their kids to succeed. That's the message that we're taking. So the only way to fix that is the messaging. And I'm firmly convinced that local messaging is more important than other kinds of messaging. So if it's the teachers and the teachers' aides and school personnel that are giving the alternate message, that really comes into play. And I've said, one of the things that I've noticed is that, these are all Title IX schools, or, they're low-income schools, and they all have parent support specialists. And if the parent support specialist it's almost always a woman, that I've talked to. If she is a bilingual herself, she's the best messenger for that, right? Like, that parents trust that person. The school trusts that person too, right? Like it's kind of the bridge. And if that person is coming from a place of experience with this, and why being bilingual is superior to being monolingual, regardless of whether we're talking monolingual English or monolingual Spanish, that is really the best delivery system for that.
Yes, if I may add to that, because this is definitely a topic that is at the center of my research interest as well, is I would say that the family captures, as you were saying, Robert, that captures the messages, and therefore they see they don't want their kids to be hurt, they don't want their kids to be discriminated. Maybe they have themselves, the parents have suffered some discrimination because of their origin, because they speak Spanish in particular. Let's also remember that not all languages are made equal. So that's another. So in there are languages that have been minoritized in a community, and they're definitely being the subject of or part of some the racial and ethnic discrimination that exists in the society where this family lives. So definitely, if they think that they perceive the message that speaking English, or maybe sometimes only English, should be the way for their children to succeed, they are going to take that route. So I think information is important. Trusting the schools, of course, as you were mentioning, Robert, is crucial, and the teacher has a crucial role here. I think we are running out of time. Do we have time for one more question, or I think we're stopping here?
I think that we have to stop here due to time, although the conversation has really been so enlightening, and appreciate so much that both your talk, Rob, and this conversation has really capped it off. So thank you both. I also just wanted to note that, Rob, you have the best behaved dog in the world. I love the fact that your dog has been behind you, and if my dog was behind me, you would know it and hear it all.
There's actually a second one back there too that didn't get as much screen time.
That's part of, or the best thing about Zoom is that we get these little windows into people's lives, and pets are always welcome. Well, again, thank you both, Rob and Dina, and to everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate you doing that, and I invite you to join us again on April 27th, same time of noon to 1 Central. And UT Dallas will be hosting, and we'll be learning more about relational health, looking at research to practice with families of children with autism or hearing differences. And so again, please mark your calendars to join us then, and join me once again in thanking both Dr. Krasno and Dr. Castro. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.